it's my great pleasure to introduce the Lord Chancellor, Alex Chalk, to the stage for the closing address of the conference. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, look, thank you so much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm so pleased to be here. I really am. And just to say a few words to close this, I think it's the third annual conference on strategic lawsuits against public participation. So thank you very much to Justice for Journalists and the Foreign Policy Centre for inviting me. So look, the first thing I want to say is it's just extraordinary how far we've come from the first conference in 2021, which was there highlighting this extraordinarily insidious trend. And then 2 years later, we actually already have legislation on the statute book to combat slaps. And I say that with a real degree of humility, because I know a huge amount of that is the responsibility of people in this room. And I hope you'll forgive me if I just take a moment or two to reprise points that I know you're very familiar with, but I think do bear emphasis and why this all matters. So a free press is, of course, the hallmark of a functioning democracy, not just a democracy that calls itself as such, but a functioning democracy. And that's because it calls out wrongdoing and it helps to make sure those with power and influence are held to account, it says here. No, of course, that's very important. As a politician, I always welcome scrutiny of the decisions I make, something I must remind myself of next time I'm up at 5 a.m. to face a grilling from Nick Robinson. But anyway, there we go. There are, however, hugely powerful and enormously wealthy people who've decided that the same scrutiny doesn't, or at least shouldn't, apply to them, even where their actions pose legitimate questions to answer. From the leaders of large multinational corporations to super-rich oligarchs with links to Vladimir Putin, there are organisations and individuals using their considerable resources to weaponise the UK's world-renowned courts, to shield them from scrutiny, using proceedings not to protect themselves from genuine insult or intrusion, but instead to draw a veil over their discreditable business practices and activities. And it's no exaggeration to say that our media, many of you in the room today, have been under siege from these lawsuits. Purporting to be genuine claims, in reality, they're used to keep you from speaking out and preventing the fruits of your often painstaking investigative labours from ever seeing the light of day. And what's worse is that slaps primarily target individuals, you, rather than the organisations you work for. And what that means is that despite finding clear evidence of wrongdoing, many of you will have felt penned in by legal barbed wire, facing lengthy legal battles and bills. You and others like you will have been forced to give up on your investigations for fear of financial ruin. In the very real sense, slaps are designed not just to silence people, but in some cases to break them. And I know from the harrowing testimony submitted to our call for evidence just how much of a toll this can take, not just on the financial affairs of those who've been targeted, but also their well-being. We know that the Eurasian Natural Resources Corporation's case against Tom Burgess and the cases brought by multiple oligarchs against Catherine Belton had a profound impact on them personally and professionally, and forced their publishers to take on eye-watering legal costs. Further afield, the Maltese journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia was facing 40 cases when she was murdered. And that was owing to her meticulous research into corruption and economic crime. It's important to recognise that in addition to denying the public information that is vital to democracy and the rule of law, every minute of court time used for a slap is a time stolen from citizens, law-abiding citizens, wishing to urgently vindicate their legitimate rights and freedoms. So there is not only a cost to society as a whole, nor just to individual journalists alone, but to every person who needs the courts to ensure their protection or to uphold their rights. And reports estimate that a majority of slaps are connected to financial crime and corruption, potentially concealing all manner of complex and most likely interconnected wrongdoing in our country. Now, of course, we are far from the only nation grappling with this issue. The Coalition Against Slaps in Europe database showed that while the number of cases in the UK decreased from 2021 to 2022, there has been an increase in slaps across Europe from 570 cases in 2022 to over 820 cases this year. The European Union is considering a directive on cross-border slaps, which may be brought in next year, and elsewhere in the world, Judicial activism in South Africa, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, has led to new constitutional jurisprudence addressing slaps. And in North America, we're aware, aren't we, that US states and Canadian provinces are taking a step-by-step approach to legislating individually. So in that international context, let's take a second to look at what exactly we've done here at home. I think we can take quiet pride in the fact that we are the first country, as opposed to particular regions, the first country to introduce national legislation on SLAP. So not a piecemeal regional approach or allowing case law to evolve incrementally, but national legislation. And so when I came to office in April, there was a question mark about whether we should move forward with plans to amend the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Bill that was then before Parliament to include measures to combat SLAPs. My clear view was that it was the right thing to do because we needed to act rapidly on that issue. Once that decision was made, these measures were brought onto the statute book with, I think, on any fair view, exceptional speed. The Act that came into force last month gives our judges new powers to dismiss false claims which are clearly designed to silence the media and campaigners. And they do that in three ways. First, by defining what a SLAP is in law and reflecting practices around them that, whilst quite commonplace in litigation, are not used in SLAPs to vindicate a right, but instead abused to harass, to subdue, to suppress. Second, by introducing a fair early dismissal mechanism that can be speedily deployed against SLAPs cases without the risk of inappropriately dismissing meritorious claims. In that way, it steers a path between, on the one hand, stamping out misconduct without delay, and on the other, permitting legitimate claims to progress where it is right to do so. And third, by limiting the costs a defendant may face, removing the potential for ruinous and exorbitant legal bills and the risks journalists have of losing everything, from their homes to their livelihoods, simply for doing their jobs. From the call for evidence in March 2022 to publishing findings in July last year to now having a law already in place is I hope, can be fairly termed a remarkable turnaround. The government is hugely grateful for the input of so many people, including many of you in the room today representing the UK Anti-SLAP Coalition. By any measure, what you have achieved demonstrates that the UK can and will take decisive action to lead the way. But we recognise that while the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act does combat the majority of SLAPs and represents a substantial step forward, in practice this captures cases that are economic in nature. And that's because, I'm sure you know this, but it bears emphasis, when bills make their way through Parliament, what can be added is limited by their scope. Parliament has set their ambit. In this case, it meant that SLAP's amendments to the legislation could only focus on economic crime. You'll remember it was the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act. That doesn't give you latitude to make a wide-ranging amendments. And so any attempt to add such broader measures would have been ruled out of scope. Efforts to effect further changes in the law would therefore have been wasted. But we are going to finish the job. We are determined to put an end to any cases, economic or otherwise, which are used to silence the free press that we all cherish, and we plan to do so when parliamentary time allows. But in the meantime, we will use the intervening time profitably. Ministry of Justice officials continue building our evidence base on SLAPs to inform future legislation. So in practice, what that means is we have already, for example, conducted a roundtable with experts, and we're planning further such discussions in the new year. We know that the spectrum of SLAPs cases now spans victims of sexual harassment and even tenant and landlord disputes. It also encompasses academics publishing critical scholarship to victims of botched cosmetic surgery. We will ensure that when we identify a further parliamentary mechanism to take action on SLAPs in all their forms, the measures will have all the tools necessary to defeat them. And that is not all. A new task force recently set up by my colleagues at DCMS is working with our colleagues in the media, including many of you, and our world-renowned legal sector to look at non-legislative options to further tackle the scourge. On the international stage, we continue to work with multilateral organisations to ensure our efforts to stamp out SLAPs in our jurisdiction align with our international partners. The British government was at the forefront of the Council of Europe's recently concluded SLAPS expert working group, driving the agenda across Europe. The recommendation will now make its way to Council of Europe ministers for adoption. My colleague at the Ministry of Justice, Lord Bellamy, recently met Teresa Ribeiro, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media, for a meeting on the UK's intended direction against SLAPS, and we have an ambitious programme of international engagement planned for next year. And we're also supporting foreign governments who have approached us for guidance in implementing their own SLAPS reforms. And we're proud, quietly proud, to be playing a leading role in attempts to stop SLAPS anywhere in the world. So look, in closing, I want to thank Justice for Journalists and the Foreign Policy Centre, both for organising the conference today, but also for the crucial work they do every single day to monitor and highlight attacks on the media, as well as to fund and fight challenges to SLAPS. The government is resolutely on the side of freedom of speech and a free press. We are on the side of those who investigate without fear or favour and who follow the evidence in the public interest. And we are determined to carry on working in partnership with you to safeguard the scrutiny that is the touchstone of a democracy that is worthy of the name. Thank you for listening.